The quiet of the Saturday afternoon was first broken not by sound, but by a subtle shift in the light across my living room floor, and then, immediately, by the familiar, high-pitched giggle from Mrs. Albright's yard. I had been sitting there for 3 hours, undisturbed, tracing a complex acquisition strategy on a legal pad, but that giggle, paired with the sudden, sharp silence that followed it, was a familiar cadence in this neighborhood. It meant one thing: the topic of conversation had shifted to me. I was 42, calm by nature, and an M&A strategist by trade, a profession that taught me to view emotion as a liability and data as absolute. My current focus was less on billion-dollar mergers and more on the quiet, local malice that had begun to seep into the foundations of my family home. The conflict had been building for months, a slow, calculated tightening of a noose made of whispers and conjecture. Victor Hayes was the architect. A local real estate broker, 45, with a sharp suit, a wider smile than was necessary, and a bottomless well of professional vanity. He'd always resented the legacy of my father, a man who had politely and legally outperformed Victor in every business venture they'd ever touched. Victor had a public-facing theory for my recent sabbatical: a massive financial collapse, a near-total loss of my capital in a corporate deal that had, indeed, failed to close. What he did not know, what he could not fathom through the thick lens of his own self-importance, was that he was not simply reporting the news, he had written the script. The whispers he planted were precise: Diana is leveraged, Diana is desperate, the house will be gone by October. The rumors culminated 3 weeks ago when I received the first of his predatory, lowball offers on the house, delivered through a numbered shell company he was too arrogant to believe I could trace. The offer was insulting, barely covering the mortgage, a clear attempt to capitalize on what he assumed was my ruin. I looked at the offer, a thin piece of paper delivered in a heavy, embossed envelope, and saw not a financial document, but the naked face of his betrayal and deep-seated petty jealousy. It wasn't the number that registered, it was the calculated humiliation of the act. My first response was entirely internal, a quiet inventory of all the pieces he had moved against me. My secondary emotional tone is always calm, a necessity in the field of hostile takeovers, and I let that stillness settle over me. Anger is a costly expenditure of energy that yields no favorable data. The facts, however, were entirely different from the fiction he had created. That massive, failed deal. It had been a strategic pivot. I had secured a non-recourse loan months before, insulating my personal wealth entirely. The failure of the deal had, ironically, only freed up capital for new, smaller, more immediate acquisitions. I wasn't broke, I was liquid, unburdened, and entirely focused. What Victor failed to account for, what people always fail to account for when they mistake quiet behavior for weakness, was that I had been gathering my own evidence. While he was busy circulating gossip on the neighborhood message boards and preparing his next pathetic offer, I had instructed Marcus Chen, a forensic accountant who worked with the meticulousness of a surgeon, to begin an audit of Victor's own tangled finances. His arrogance had given me an opening, and my calm disposition ensured that no one, least of all Victor, saw the strategic reversal coming. I picked up my legal pad, closed the financial model, and moved to the next step of my plan. Victor thought he was squeezing me out of the block. He had, in fact, simply handed me a map to the block's true ownership. Victor thought he was squeezing me out of the block. He had, in fact, simply handed me a map to the block's true ownership. The rumors were effective, I conceded that much to his petty effort. The tangible cost of his gossip was not financial, but social, and in a neighborhood like ours, social currency often dictates property value. Invitations to the quarterly neighborhood association meetings, which were never about governance and always about conspicuous consumption, evaporated. The few, brief smiles I received walking my dog were quickly retracted by averted gazes, weighted down by the perceived pity of my impending downfall. These people, my neighbors, had watched my father build his life here brick by brick, yet they were so quick to believe the narrative of my sudden, dramatic ruin, a narrative supplied by the man who felt he was owed a piece of that legacy. I observed this social withdrawal without emotion, It merely confirmed the structural fragility of their loyalty and the depth of Victor's own influence, which was, fundamentally, built on sand. My actual work began not in defense, but in counterattack. I called Marcus Chen, the forensic accountant. Marcus is a study in quiet precision, a man whose patience rivals a deep-sea dredge. His task was never about proving my solvency, my records were impeccable and private, but about exposing the rot in Victor's foundation. I provided him with the dates surrounding my failed corporate deal, the names of the few rival brokers who stood to gain, and the paper trail of the shell corporation Victor used to make his pathetic offer. I told Marcus to look for collusion, not just coincidence. I was certain Victor's professional malice extended beyond mere gossip. The failure of that deal had been too neat, too precisely timed to coincide with the sudden appearance of his acquisition offer. The silence I maintained throughout this period was my most valuable asset. It allowed Victor to continue operating under the blissful delusion that his plan was succeeding. He doubled down on his arrogance, parading his latest luxury SUV past my driveway multiple times a day, often timing his route to coincide with mine. His wife, a woman whose entire personality was an extension of his perceived wealth, began holding impromptu, visible afternoon gatherings on their front lawn, ensuring the noise and the chatter reached my windows, a constant, low-grade acoustic assault of their imagined victory. They mistook my composure for resignation, my privacy for shame. In reality, I was simply waiting for the data to come back from Marcus. The evidence he found solidified everything. Leverage 1, a highly encrypted series of communications between Victor and one of my former competitors, detailing the timing and the execution of a strategy to tank my acquisition. It was a violation of multiple real estate and fiduciary codes, a blatant, criminal act of market manipulation. Also, Victor could buy my house for cents on the dollar and parade his undeserved triumph. The second piece, Leverage 2, was a series of audio files, recorded by one of his own disgruntled junior agents, capturing Victor boasting about how he had engineered the situation. His precise, repulsive phrase, which I listened to only once and immediately filed away, was that he was going to squeeze Diana out of the block, property by property, until she's left standing in the street with a for sale sign taped to her back. That particular line was useful. It confirmed the breadth of his intent, not just my home, but the entire block. And it gave me the required emotional detachment. Victor was no longer a person who had slighted me, he was an economic variable who had introduced an unacceptable level of risk and instability into my market, and my response would now be purely structural. He had handed me the moral high ground and, more importantly, the legal justification to dismantle not just his ownership of the block, but his career and his reputation entirely. The calm before the storm was not peace, it was the quiet, meticulous charging of the battery, ensuring the coming operation would be decisive and absolute. The map to the block's ownership was in my hand, and the coordinates led straight to the full, tangible consequences of his deceit. I was ready to begin phase 2, the acquisition. The map to the block's ownership was in my hand, and the coordinates led straight to the full, tangible consequences of his deceit. I was ready to begin phase 2, the acquisition. This phase required far more discretion and strategy than any hostile takeover I had managed in the corporate world, primarily because the assets were houses, which carry sentimental value, and the environment was saturated with Victor's influence. I had to operate in a way that was invisible to a man whose specialty was local market visibility. The entire operation had to be structured to look like a series of unrelated, cash-based transactions, entirely outside the standard broker network. Marcus's work was the key to this camouflage. My focus shifted from the external threat posed by Victor to the internal logistics of the neighborhood itself. This block, running from Elm Street to the small park, contained 12 prime residential properties. Victor had long viewed it as his personal fiefdom, boasting publicly about having secured listings for 8 of them at various times over the past decade. What Victor failed to realize was that 4 of those homeowners were facing various degrees of financial stress, a silent, common reality that his loud, self-aggrandizing success obscured. These were not properties that would pass through his standard brokerage. They were distressed or pre-distressed assets, ripe for quiet, immediate cash buyout. The first asset I targeted was the old Rutherford house on the corner. Mrs. Rutherford, a sweet woman in her late 70s, had been quietly struggling with mounting medical bills and the cost of maintaining her sprawling, antique home. Victor, in his characteristic cruelty, had been pressuring her to list, offering her $100,000 less than market value, promising a quick, clean sale. He believed he was the only buyer. I knew better. I approached Mrs. Rutherford not as a desperate seller, but as a longtime neighbor, fully aware of her plight and prepared to offer an elegant solution. I used a completely separate holding company, incorporated in a different state, managed by Marcus's trusted paralegal, and never, under any circumstances, tied back to Diana. The offer was simple, fair, and above the appraised value: a full, all-cash offer, immediate closing, and a 6-month rent-free leaseback option so she could transition gracefully, with dignity and privacy. This was not a business transaction, it was a reversal of Victor's malice, done with capital he believed I lacked. The documents were signed 2 weeks later. The property was mine. The ownership transfer was registered under a generic LLC name, designed to vanish into the ocean of corporate registrations. The speed of the first acquisition gave me immediate leverage on the next 3 distressed properties. I moved with the same strategy: cash, discretion, dignity. The second property was owned by the Millers, who were relocating suddenly due to a job change and desperately needed liquidity. The third was a small investment house owned by an absentee landlord who was tired of dealing with tenants and simply wanted to divest quickly. None of these owners ever spoke to Victor, whose reputation for predatory tactics, once quietly exposed, was enough to make them seek alternatives. Each closing was handled by a different, anonymous lawyer in different counties. To Victor, these were just random, quick sales that somehow bypassed his network. He probably dismissed them as flukes, not recognizing the disciplined execution of a single strategy. I continued to live in my own house, maintaining the facade of a woman managing her supposed financial instability. I kept the lights low in the evenings. I drove the same car. I answered the phone with the same calm reserve. My silence was his greatest assurance. He needed to believe that his whispers had driven me to the periphery, that my energy was consumed by fear and budgeting, not by multi-million-dollar real estate purchases. I knew he was watching me, waiting for the moment I would crack and put the for sale sign in my own manicured lawn. The irony was the silence was costing him everything. My house was the last asset on the block I intended to acquire, and I would take it from him not by selling it to him, but by ensuring that when he finally realized the scale of my operation, he would have nothing left to buy. The stage was set, the periphery was secured, and now it was time to move the evidence into play. My house was the last asset on the block I intended to acquire, and I would take it from him not by selling it to him, but by ensuring that when he finally realized the scale of my operation, he would have nothing left to buy. The stage was set, the periphery was secured, and now it was time to move the evidence into play. The strategic acquisitions of the 4 properties, all cash, all quiet, all under disparate corporate entities, represented the silent encirclement of Victor's professional home base. He still saw the neighborhood as a collection of desirable listings, I saw it as a contiguous portfolio of assets under centralized control. The 5th and 6th properties were the most complex because they were not distressed. They were owned by the Hendersons and the Scotts, 2 families who were financially stable and happy in their homes. These purchases required a different kind of leverage, strategic irritation. I knew Victor was planning to leverage my supposed panic to secure a massive development deal on the vacant lot adjacent to the Hendersons' property, a lot he had long coveted. His plan was to push through a zoning variance for multi-unit housing, a move that would immediately devalue every single family home on the block while generating a massive commission for himself. This was his true end game, not just my house, but turning the entire block into his personal development site. I preempted his move by buying the vacant lot myself, again through an anonymous entity, closing the deal with unexpected speed and cash liquidity. I then immediately filed a restrictive covenant on the lot, legally binding the land to be used only as a private, community green space. No development, no multi-units, no noise. The instant Victor's plan for the high-density development collapsed, the Hendersons and the Scotts realized exactly how little protection their own broker offered them. Victor had been actively selling them a future of construction noise and reduced property value, while I, the supposed bankrupt neighbor, had just preserved their quality of life. I never spoke to them about Victor. The restrictive covenant and the sudden absence of Victor's incessant phone calls regarding the zoning board spoke for themselves. The Hendersons were the first to call. Not to ask about my finances, but to ask who had bought the lot and if they might be interested in a private sale. They were now looking for certainty and protection, not a mere transaction. I offered them a premium over market value, structured as a silent, lifetime leaseback at a nominal rent. They could stay as long as they wished, but the deed would transfer now, out of Victor's reach. They accepted. The terms were cold, but the result was peace of mind, a currency Victor could never offer. The Scotts followed a week later, realizing that the value of their stability was worth more than the slight capital gains Victor perpetually promised. With their house, the total count stood at 6 properties and the vacant lot. The entire northern arc of the block, roughly 50% of the housing stock, was now mine. All transactions were non-public, shielded by layered corporate structures designed to prevent even the most dedicated broker from piecing the puzzle together. I continued to live simply, driving my 10-year-old sedan, receiving Victor's condescending emails about market instability, and generally behaving like a woman slowly preparing for inevitable failure. The setup was complete. I had legally secured the perimeter, exposed his professional malice with Marcus's evidence, and neutralized his primary financial ambition for the area. Victor was still operating under the assumption that I was his sole target, a lone, cornered asset he was about to acquire at a discount. He had no idea he was now a goldfish swimming in a tank that I had quietly purchased, along with the stand and the entire room it sat in. I was no longer a victim seeking justice, I was a majority shareholder taking full control of the assets. The time for silent preparation was over. It was time for escalation, and I intended for it to be very, very public. The setup was complete. I had legally secured the perimeter, exposed his professional malice with Marcus's evidence, and neutralized his primary financial ambition for the area. Victor was still operating under the assumption that I was his sole target, a lone, cornered asset he was about to acquire at a discount. He had no idea he was now a goldfish swimming in a tank that I had quietly purchased, along with the stand and the entire room it sat in. I was no longer a victim seeking justice, I was a majority shareholder taking full control of the assets. The time for silent preparation was over. It was time for escalation, and I intended for it to be very, very public. Escalation began not with an announcement, but with a piece of paper, a highly formal, carefully worded cease and desist order delivered to Victor Hayes' brokerage office at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. The document was generated by a top-tier law firm in the city, known for handling corporate regulatory affairs, and it cited specific state statutes regarding unfair business practices, market manipulation, and the misuse of non-public financial information. It didn't mention my name once. It was sent from the legal counsel of a newly formed entity called Elm Street Holdings LLC, the umbrella corporation I created to manage the growing portfolio of properties. The immediate, tactical goal was to freeze his activities and force a public acknowledgement of a major new player in his market. The C&D order, which was intentionally designed to look like the opening salvo of a major competitor, accused his firm of disseminating false information designed to depress property values for personal gain. It demanded the immediate cessation of all direct communication regarding property acquisition with current residents of the Elm Street block and the retraction of all previously published market advisories that had suggested an imminent devaluation. Victor, whose ego was as thin as his ethics, immediately dismissed it. He saw the LLC name, looked for my name in the ownership registry, which, of course, wasn't there, and concluded it was a weak attempt by a rival firm trying to interfere with his imminent closing of my family home. He didn't know the filing itself was the bait. His response, predictable and arrogant, was to instruct his lawyer to send a blustering, dismissive reply, promising countersuit and a public campaign against this unwarranted corporate aggression. This was the exact response I needed. It proved he would not retreat and that he was prepared to escalate the dispute into the public sphere, which was precisely where I planned to destroy him. I then executed the second step, the public revelation of ownership. I didn't hold a press conference. Instead, I coordinated with the neighborhood association, the same association that had quietly revoked my invitation, to attend their emergency meeting regarding the future of the block. Victor had been scheduled to present a modified, still highly profitable, development plan now that his multi-unit variants had been blocked by the Green Space Covenant. I arrived precisely at the start time, impeccably dressed, carrying only a slim portfolio. The temperature in the room dropped instantly when I walked in. Victor, seated at the head table, offered a look of smug, pitying surprise. He was preparing a verbal ambush, no doubt, a condescending inquiry into my financial planning. I offered a calm, neutral nod and took the only empty seat, far from the front. The meeting proceeded through the standard pleasantries, eventually arriving at Victor's presentation. He stood up, beaming, and launched into his revised plan, a series of townhouses, slightly less dense, but still highly disruptive. He spoke of the unforeseen legal complications that had blocked his original plan, alluding darkly to my supposed financial meddling without proof. He then concluded by saying he would continue to work tirelessly on behalf of the homeowners of this block. That was my cue. I raised my hand, calmly and deliberately. When called upon, I stood. I did not raise my voice, but I ensured every word was delivered with the absolute precision of a hammer blow. I believe there is a fundamental conflict of interest in Mr. Hayes' presentation, I stated, looking directly at the association president. Mr. Hayes is speaking on behalf of the homeowners, but he does not represent the majority interest of the block. As of this morning, through Elm Street Holdings LLC, I am the controlling interest. I own 6 of the 12 residential properties on the block, plus the adjacent green space. The quiet that followed was absolute. Victor's smile dissolved into a mask of pure, professional horror. The shock was the true form of my revenge. It was silent, legal, and absolute. The quiet that followed was absolute. Victor's smile dissolved into a mask of pure, professional horror. He stood there, frozen mid-gesture, his hand still resting on the slide clicker, the light reflecting off the expensive watch I knew he could barely afford. The homeowners around the room, the same people who had avoided my gaze for months, were now staring at him, then at me, the calculation clear in their eyes. They hadn't dismissed me because they thought I was bad, they had dismissed me because they thought I was weak. Strength, however cold, always commands attention. 6 properties, Mr. Hayes, I reiterated, ensuring the number settled in the room. That's exactly half the residential units on Elm Street, plus the adjacent vacant lot. Given that your proposal directly impacts the stability and valuation of my portfolio, I am withdrawing support for any plan that includes multi-unit development. The block will remain exclusively single-family homes, and the adjacent lot will remain a private green space. I paused, allowing the legal weight of my statement to sink in. My goal is not development. It is preservation and stability. You can consider your entire development commission nullified. Victor finally reacted, his control snapping instantly. This is absurd, Diana. You don't have the capital. You're trying to leverage a failing position. I have an appraisal on your house, I know you're standing. This is a desperate bluff. He spoke with the desperate, loud authority of a man watching his reality disintegrate. Your appraisal is predicated on the false information you circulated, Victor, designed to depress my asset value. And as for my standing, I said, opening my portfolio, not to documents, but to a single, laminated summary sheet. I handed it directly to the association president, a man whose respect I needed to regain entirely. This is a statement from 3 separate title companies confirming the transfers, all executed between July and September. All cash. No liens, no brokerages involved. You simply weren't sharp enough to track the paper trail. I did not wait for the president to confirm the document. My eyes were locked on Victor. The question, Victor, is not my capital, but yours. If you are suggesting that I acquired 6 properties with non-existent funds, you are professionally accusing me of criminal money laundering. Is that the public statement you wish to make tonight, in front of your neighbors and potential clients?" he faltered, the sheer, cold logic of the trap paralyzing him. He knew he couldn't push the criminal accusation without risking his license and inviting external scrutiny of his own finances, which Marcus had confirmed were highly leveraged against anticipated commissions from this very block. The final element of the escalation was the delivery of the evidence. I turned to the president again. As a secondary concern, Mr. Hayes has been actively and illegally manipulating the local market, not merely through gossip, but through a documented pattern of professional misconduct, including collusion with my corporate rivals to sabotage my previous business deal. I retrieved a small, discreet digital recorder from my pocket, Marcus's audio evidence preloaded and ready. I have the complete evidence, including audio confirming his intent to squeeze Diana out of the block, property by property. This evidence has already been forwarded, along with a formal complaint detailing the wire fraud and market manipulation, to the state's Department of Real Estate and the Attorney General's office. The room erupted into a low, horrified murmur, not pity, but fear of association with Victor's exposed criminality. Victor, finally realizing the totality of my pre-planned strike, grabbed his briefcase and bolted from the room, abandoning his presentation, his credibility, and his entire professional facade on the floor behind him. The retreat was absolute. He had entered the room a powerful, respected broker, he left it a desperate, exposed criminal suspect. This silent, legal demolition was exactly what I had intended. The stage was now clear for the final, decisive act of total control. The retreat was absolute. Victor had entered the room a powerful, respected broker, he left it a desperate, exposed criminal suspect. This silent, legal demolition was exactly what I had intended. The stage was now clear for the final, decisive act of total control. The public exposure at the neighborhood meeting was the turn, the moment the power definitively shifted. The climax, however, would be the structural, irrefutable proof that Victor's downfall was not a matter of social opinion or legal maneuvering, but a pure, brutal consequence of his own financial recklessness, meticulously leveraged against him. My final move involved the asset he valued above all others, his own family home. Victor's house was a monument to his perceived success, a sprawling, over-renovated property that represented the visible excess of his arrogance. Marcus had revealed that Victor, in his frantic attempts to secure capital for the doomed development deal, had refinanced his home to the absolute limit. He had used the anticipated, massive commission from the development, a commission I had just vaporized with my controlling interest, as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan. This loan was due, in full, in 30 days. With the development commission gone and the state's Department of Real Estate instantly freezing his brokerage accounts pending their investigation, fueled by Marcus's meticulously gathered evidence of wire fraud and market manipulation, Victor was financially catastrophic. He had zero liquidity, immense short-term debt, and a professional license that was about to be suspended. His only viable option was a desperate, immediate, distress sale of his primary asset. I waited precisely 72 hours. This was enough time for the news of his professional collapse to circulate through the local banking and real estate community, ensuring maximum fear and minimum negotiation leverage on his side. Then, I had my attorney, one he had never dealt with, based 3 states away, make the call. The offer was for Victor's house, a lowball, but all cash, take it or leave it figure, precisely $50,000 less than the combined principal and interest on his impending bridge loan. It was an offer designed to save him from total foreclosure but to still inflict maximum psychological damage. The parallel with his own initial offer to me was deliberate and exact. He had offered me the bare minimum to save me from ruin, but with the intent of humiliating me. I was now offering him the bare minimum to save him from ruin, but with the intent of acquiring his most prized possession. The cold, geometric symmetry of the reversal was the true climax of the entire operation. Victor rejected the offer immediately, predictably, through his overwhelmed and suddenly nervous lawyer. He was outraged, calling the offer predatory, citing market value and the years of work he'd put into the property. His lawyer, however, was far more pragmatic, informing Victor that he had only 3 options: accept my cash offer, face certain foreclosure by the bank, or declare bankruptcy and still lose the house. There were no other buyers. The combination of the criminal investigation and the ticking clock of the bridge loan had rendered his asset toxic in the eyes of any serious, reputable investor. My offer was the only clean exit from a financial bomb. The next morning, his lawyer called back. Victor had capitulated. The signed documents were sent digitally, a cash closing in 48 hours. The terms were absolute. Victor and his family were required to vacate the premises within 5 days of the closing. There would be no leaseback, no grace period, no sentimental negotiation. The emotional goal was achieved. He was forced to face the tangible, irrevocable consequence of his arrogance. He was not merely defeated, he was expelled from the very block he had tried to conquer. He was about to watch the woman he thought he had bankrupted acquire the house he thought defined him. The next morning, his lawyer called back. Victor had capitulated. The signed documents were sent digitally, a cash closing in 48 hours. The terms were absolute. Victor and his family were required to vacate the premises within 5 days of the closing. There would be no leaseback, no grace period, no sentimental negotiation. The emotional goal was achieved. He was forced to face the tangible, irrevocable consequence of his arrogance. He was not merely defeated, he was expelled from the very block he had tried to conquer. He was about to watch the woman he thought he had bankrupted acquire the house he thought defined him. The climax was executed with the chilling precision of a perfectly timed financial strike. 48 hours later, the closing took place remotely. A wire transfer confirmed the funds were dispersed, and the deed to Victor and his wife's family home was officially transferred to my most recently established holding company, Elmwood Trust. The circle was complete, the narrative reversed. Victor had tried to make me homeless, I had made him financially solvent enough to avoid bankruptcy, but geographically exiled from his entire social and professional sphere. The true, visceral moment of the climax occurred on the final afternoon of his 5-day grace period. I had arranged for a small, very discreet, moving truck to park down the street from my house, intentionally visible but not blocking traffic. Then, I walked slowly down the street, passing his house, under the guise of walking my dog. I maintained my calm, secondary emotional tone, never breaking stride, never looking directly at the frantic activity on his porch. Victor was out there, supervising the loading of his family's belongings, the framed photos, the expensive outdoor furniture, the trappings of the life he had so meticulously curated to project success. He looked haggard, his suit replaced by rumpled clothes, his usual loud confidence replaced by a thin film of sweat and fear. He caught my eye as I walked past. He stopped moving entirely, a box of golf clubs half lifted in his hands. That single glance was the entirety of our final confrontation, the wordless climax that rendered all the prior machinations concrete. In his eyes, I saw not fury, anger required energy he no longer possessed, but a deep, shattering comprehension. He saw the cold reality of the evidence, I was never broke. The failed deal had been a footnote, and his malicious interference had merely provided me with the motivation and the legal justification to execute a hostile takeover of his entire world. The woman he mocked as bankrupt was now, legally and indisputably, his landlord's boss. I didn't stop. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't smile. I walked past his property, now technically my property, and continued to the end of the block, where the vacant lot I had turned into a green space stood. I paused there for a moment, looking back. He was still frozen, watching me. He was defeated not by violence or theatrics, but by the meticulous application of financial logic and regulatory law. The defeat was absolute, public, and self-inflicted. Returning to my own house, which stood exactly where it always had, I called Marcus. The final instructions were simple. The closing is complete. Begin phase 5, dissemination. The climax had been internal and silent, but the consequences needed to be external, loud, and professionally devastating. The next stage would ensure that this irreversible defeat was cemented into his professional record, guaranteeing that his exile would not be temporary. The fall was about to begin. The falling action commenced with the methodical, synchronized release of data. Marcus, operating with the precision of a Swiss watch, executed the dissemination plan. First, he submitted the full dossier, the encrypted emails, the audio recordings, and the financial analysis of the collapse deal, to the State Department of Real Estate's investigative unit, complete with a timeline confirming Victor's actions were deliberately calculated to manipulate my personal property value. Simultaneously, a formal complaint was filed with the state's Professional Ethics Board, citing multiple counts of fiduciary duty violation and conduct unbecoming of a licensed broker. The consequence was immediate and public. Within 24 hours, Victor's brokerage license was temporarily suspended pending a full investigation. This was not a private rebuke, it was a matter of public record. His name was flagged in the statewide realtor database, effectively paralyzing his ability to transact any business, anywhere. The financial bomb I had created was now detonating in his professional life. His remaining active listings were automatically transferred to supervising brokers, and the commissions he was still owed were frozen in escrow. The wealth he had projected, which was entirely dependent on the constant flow of new commissions, instantly dried up. His reputation, the primary engine of his arrogance, collapsed with the speed of a structural demolition. The narrative shifted from the rumor of my insolvency to the certainty of his criminality. The neighborhood, seeing the professional consequences, performed a rapid, self-serving reversal. The same people who had avoided me now offered stiff, awkward apologies or tried to engage me in long, conspiratorial conversations about how they knew he was rotten all along. I accepted neither the apologies nor the gossip. I maintained my composure and simply stated the facts. He violated the law. He has faced the consequences. The coldness of my response was intentional. I wanted to establish the new order, founded on undeniable facts, not shifting social sentiment. Victor's downfall was complete, sealed by his own paperwork and the state's official decree. His reputation, the primary engine of his arrogance, collapsed with the speed of a structural demolition. The narrative shifted from the rumor of my insolvency to the certainty of his criminality. The neighborhood, seeing the professional consequences, performed a rapid, self-serving reversal. The same people who had avoided me now offered stiff, awkward apologies or tried to engage me in long, conspiratorial conversations about how they knew he was rotten all along. I accepted neither the apologies nor the gossip. I maintained my composure and simply stated the facts. He violated the law. He has faced the consequences. The coldness of my response was intentional. I wanted to establish the new order, founded on undeniable facts, not shifting social sentiment. Victor's downfall was complete, sealed by his own paperwork and the state's official decree. The physical removal of Victor and his family was the necessary punctuation mark on the falling action. On the fifth day, I watched from my window as the final boxes were loaded into a rented box truck. There was no fanfare, only the dull scrape of cardboard on concrete. The process was humiliatingly mundane, robbing the event of any tragic nobility. His wife, who had spent months staging elaborate, loud parties to emphasize my supposed isolation, stood tearfully on the curb, looking at the house that was no longer theirs, a house now legally owned by the woman she had openly pitied. I received a final, desperate communication from Victor's lawyer the following week, a plea for a temporary leaseback agreement on the house, citing the difficulty of finding immediate, suitable housing for his children. This was the final, faint attempt at appealing to a humanity he had proven he did not possess. I instructed my lawyer to respond with a single, clear message: no. I provided no explanation, no justification. The response needed to be as absolute and devoid of compromise as his own actions had been. The consequences were not meant to be soft, they were meant to be definitive and educational. Meanwhile, the professional inquiry escalated. The Attorney General's office, armed with Marcus's impeccable evidence of wire fraud and market manipulation, informed Victor's counsel that they would be pursuing a civil recovery suit targeting the entirety of his remaining liquid assets, seeking damages on behalf of the clients he had misled and the market stability he had threatened. His attempt to buy his way out of the bridge loan by selling the house to me was the last functional financial move he would ever make. The remaining wealth he possessed was now earmarked for legal judgment. He was professionally finished and financially gutted. With Victor physically removed and legally neutralized, the final pieces of the falling action involved my integration into the new reality of the block. The neighbors who remained, the other 6 owners, suddenly treated me with a deference bordering on fear. They recognized power, cold and absolute, and they now understood that their stability depended on my approval. I used this quiet leverage not for malice, but for quiet reorganization. I convened a meeting, not of the neighborhood association, but of the property owners of Elm Street Holdings LLC. I introduced them to the new structure. I was the owner, but my plan was long-term stability. I assured the Hendersons and the Scotts that their rent-free leasebacks were secure, and I initiated plans to turn the green space lot into a formal, maintained community garden, open only to block residents. Order was being restored, but strictly on my terms, with cold, strategic control. With Victor physically removed and legally neutralized, the final pieces of the falling action involved my integration into the new reality of the block. The neighbors who remained, the other 6 owners, suddenly treated me with a deference bordering on fear. They recognized power, cold and absolute, and they now understood that their stability depended on my approval. I used this quiet leverage not for malice, but for quiet reorganization. I convened a meeting, not of the neighborhood association, but of the property owners of Elm Street Holdings LLC. I introduced them to the new structure. I was the owner, but my plan was long-term stability. I assured the Hendersons and the Scotts that their rent-free leasebacks were secure, and I initiated plans to turn the green space lot into a formal, maintained community garden, open only to block residents. Order was being restored, but strictly on my terms, with cold, strategic control. The end of the story was not a moment of celebration, but a quiet, calculated solidification of the new status quo. The concept of forgiveness was irrelevant, there was no emotional debt to be settled, only a structural imbalance that had been corrected. My final, most satisfying act of the entire operation was entirely symbolic, designed to physically erase the last vestige of Victor's presence and establish my vision for the block's future. I began with Victor's former home, now mine. I didn't intend to live there, my family home was where I belonged, but I intended to reshape it. My first instruction to my contractor was to strip the house of every single garish, over-the-top renovation Victor had installed to project his insecure wealth. The imported marble, the unnecessary fountain, the showy landscaping designed purely for public consumption, all of it was removed. The house was taken back to a state of dignified, classic simplicity, turning a monument of false success into a simple, highly valuable rental property. Next came the formal establishment of the Elm Street Community Trust, a nonprofit entity I founded with Marcus to manage the maintenance and long-term stability of the properties. The core mandate of the trust was explicitly anti-development and anti-speculation, ensuring the block could never again be vulnerable to the type of predatory maneuvers Victor had attempted. I legally endowed the vacant green space to this trust, cementing its purpose as a permanent fixture, legally binding future owners to its restrictions. The financial data confirmed the absolute nature of the defeat. Victor's final assets were seized by the Attorney General's civil judgment, and his brokerage license was permanently revoked following the full investigation. His professional identity was destroyed, and his financial standing was reduced to zero. He had traded my perceived bankruptcy for his actual, public ruin. The 6 properties I acquired were refinanced under the long-term, low-interest holding company structure, providing sustained passive income and cementing my role as the primary, stabilizing force in the neighborhood. I did not buy the whole block, but I had acquired the controlling interest and, more importantly, the emotional and regulatory leverage to dictate its future. The ending was quiet, cold, and final. I stood in my kitchen one afternoon, drinking coffee, looking out at the street. Everything was calm. The whispers were gone, replaced by the silence of deference. The justice was not sweet, it was merely correct, the inevitable result of applying superior intellect and superior capital against reckless arrogance. Order was restored, absolutely, and on my terms. I was never broke. Now, the entire block knew it. My work here was done. The 6 properties I acquired were refinanced under the long-term, low-interest holding company structure, providing sustained passive income and cementing my role as the primary, stabilizing force in the neighborhood. I did not buy the whole block, but I had acquired the controlling interest and, more importantly, the emotional and regulatory leverage to dictate its future. The ending was quiet, cold, and final. I stood in my kitchen one afternoon, drinking coffee, looking out at the street. Everything was calm. The whispers were gone, replaced by the silence of deference. The justice was not sweet, it was merely correct, the inevitable result of applying superior intellect and superior capital against reckless arrogance. Order was restored, absolutely, and on my terms. I was never broke. Now, the entire block knew it. My work here was done. The restoration of order, however, required one final, public statement, not of triumph, but of finality. It was delivered not through words, but through architecture. Victor's old house, once stripped of its gaudiness, was repainted a deep, reserved charcoal gray, a color that stood out against the block's traditional palette, marking it as a property under new, distinct management. The message was clear, a new era of cold, stable control had begun. I then addressed the issue of my own family home. It was never for sale, it was the emotional anchor that Victor had tried to sever. To reinforce its permanence and my own solvency, I initiated a major, visible renovation, not an ostentatious one, but a deep, structural investment in its future. I replaced the roof, upgraded all the systems, and expanded the rear sunroom, projects that were financially significant, visible, and utterly undeniable proof of my deep liquidity and commitment to the neighborhood. The sound of professional construction, not gossip, was the new ambient noise of Elm Street. My relationship with the remaining neighbors settled into a pattern of cool, transactional respect. They no longer sought to pity or dismiss me, they sought my stability. The few who had been most openly critical of my supposed fall were handled with a precise application of distance. They were not invited to participate in the new community garden I funded and maintained through the trust. Their exclusion was silent, legal, and absolute, the consequence of their own poor judgment and quickness to betray. Forgiveness was never a requirement of my plan. Consequences were. The revenge narrative concluded not with a dramatic exit or a confrontation, but with the mundane reality of paperwork. I received the final letter from the State Attorney General's office, confirming the successful execution of the civil judgment against Victor Hayes and the permanent revocation of his license. I read the document, confirming the figures, and then filed it neatly away in the fireproof safe, next to the deeds of the 7 properties I now controlled. I looked out at the street one last time, taking a slow sip of coffee. The block was quiet, subdued, and entirely predictable, a perfect portfolio. The man who had whispered I was broke was gone, financially ruined and professionally exiled, his entire legacy wiped clean by the weight of his own hubris. I had never needed to raise my voice, display my anger, or resort to anything but the cold, clear power of logic and capital. I bought the whole block, not to own every deed, but to own the entire narrative. I was, as always, calm, composed, and absolutely in control. My work was complete.